I came to Yale in 1978. So I've been, and then I was in the psychiatry department for the first year, and then I moved to this neurosurgery department in '79. So I've been here very fortunately since then. So it's way long before you were born. So it's about, I think it's about 33 years now since I've been here. So it's a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So I know kind of Yale well. And regards my association with the religious life here, I have been associated with the Episcopal Church at Yale since I came here, and I've been, in various capacities there as a student, as a postdoc, as a student member. Then I was on their board of governors for many years. I served as the secretary of the board of governors for about, I think, 10 years. Then I served as the vice president of the board of governors for about another 9 years, I think, and I essentially ran the ministry. And then I left for a little while, and I went as the college chaplain to Trinity College, Hartford, thinking that I was going to leave Yale and go there. And I wanted to take my labs with me, but as it turned out, they didn't really come up with all the lab space I needed and so forth. So I ended up not staying there, and I came back to Yale. But I sort of served as chaplain there for almost 3 years, commuting back and forth. And then when I came back here, the chaplaincy at Yale, the Episcopal Church at Yale, was in some financial difficulty, and they couldn't really afford a chaplain. So I said, well, I'll sort of take it on for a little while and help them put the house back in order and get some funds. And that was about, that was in 2000. What I find interesting is that as a college chaplain, you're always challenged by students' questions about faith and religion. And so that's the big piece that I enjoy. So.
Can you tell me more about what type of questions you might have to confront from students?
So it's a variety of questions that you get, and I think let me sort of get back. A lot of people ask me the question when they realize I'm an active scientist, researcher, teacher, and also sort of person who has some faith issues that I espouse. How does that kind of work? And I think I have various ways of responding to that, but recently I saw actually quite an interesting quote about a story about Niels Bohr. Niels Bohr was the sort of father of mechanics, and he said that when he was a kid, it was when he realized the nature of sort of the universe and ultimate reality. And he said as a kid he used to was fascinated by his fish pond. And he said he used to sit by this fish pond and look at these fish for hours and hours and hours swimming in this pond. And then he said he realized that this fish had no idea that he was watching them. Right? And all they knew was that what was in their pond. And when the sun came up, the pond, the illumination increased, but they had really no clue about what was doing it. And when it rained, they kind of knew the water rippled on the top and churned it up. But they had no sense of any reality outside of the pond. And so he said, he thought, well, what about human beings? We are impacted by multiple dimensions of reality, but do we really only know the dimension that we experience? So he said, actually I made a note of this because I thought it was kind of interesting. I read recently, and he said he wondered whether humans were like the fish, being acted upon by multiple dimensions of reality, but aware only of a limited frame of reference. So I think in a sense, that's sort of what was interesting to me. I think as what I say as a scientist, I'm very interested in understanding how things are that are already there. In my case, I'm very fascinated about how the brain works. And that's what I do, try to understand how the brain works. But the brain is already there, right? And so I try to understand that as a scientist, using a certain set of tools, using my senses and measurement of the brain and brain activity, using the tools that are there and so forth. But they're limited by the sort of the tools that I can bring to bear and my senses. But sort of Ball says, my faith says that there is perhaps a wider wider reality.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what religion does is, religion is one of the tools of investigating that wider reality. It's not, I wouldn't say it's the only tool, but it's one of them. And so then you come to it from another point of view. It's an issue of epistemology, as the big word philosophers use.
Mm-hmm.
Epistemology is how do you acquire knowledge? So a scientist acquires knowledge by the use of the scientist's senses and the use of various tools that there are to investigate the world around us. But I think for me, the appeal is that I think there are other tools that we don't have as well developed tools, but there are other ways of also acquiring knowledge and investigating the world around us. And so philosophers do it in one way. Philosophers use their mind, right? They think, they question, and they grapple with problems and come up with understandings of how things are.
Mm-hmm.
In a very different way. And I think religious people have, so why am I not a philosopher, and why is religion? I think religion gives you another set of tools to explore this other reality. And those tools are very ancient tools, such as prayer, contemplation, imagination, all those kinds of things. So it gives you another set of tools to explore reality. Whether that reality is true or not, we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the impact that reality has on your life that I think matters.
Right.
From a religious perspective. So those are some of the answers I give people. And then there are very specific issues that they will raise if we go down this conversation. But the big question that people ask me is, how do you know there's a God? And I say, I don't know. But I say I work with a notion that there may be, and I then give them this sort of explanation. I say, as a scientist, right? As a scientist, when I want to learn about something, right, understand something, so understand the brain, right? Also, good neuroscientists will tell you that we don't know exactly how the brain works,
Mm-hmm.
right? We know some things about how the brain works, right, which we have been able to inquire into, measure, understand. But we see as we get new tools, we learn more about how the brain works and functions. And every time we learn more, we change our ideas about what the brain is and how it works and how it can do things.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we engage on this journey? So when I want to understand something about, I'm interested, for instance, as a scientist, in how the brain is involved in seizures,
Mm-hmm.
in generating epilepsy, for instance. That's one of the big things I do. I'm also interested in what happens to the brain when it's impacted by some kind of traumatic event. My interest is particularly trauma that's produced if a bomb explodes near you. What does it do? Now, how do I go about this? I say, okay, let me look at what I know so far. right? So I will take all the information I can get. There's a lot of published papers on, so let's say seizures. There's a lot of published papers on how the brain generates seizures. And how neurons work and what other parts of the brain might be involved in generating seizures and so forth. So I take all this information and then I say, well, but it doesn't really explain how a particular type of epilepsy happens, called temporal lobe epilepsy. And I want to know how that happens. So I say, okay, I put all the information I have together and I create what a scientist would call an investigative model or a working hypothesis. So there are different names that are used for this. Some basis on which we start, right? So I say, okay, I think, let's take the brain again. I say, I think the brain is constructed like this. So it has these parts, and these parts work together like this, and so on and so forth. But I don't know how the brain does, what happens when we think, for instance, right? So I said, well, what I do is then I set up a hypothesis. I say, well, I think when you think, this is what happens. Right? Now, that's not true. I'm just hypothesizing that, right? So then what do? Then I go ahead and I say, all right, how do I test that? Right? So I would practice an experiment that would have as a hypothesis, you know, a particular notion, and then I would try to test that notion experimentally, and then I do an experiment, and then I get a particular result. And that result may confirm what I thought, right? So then I say, okay, good. I think that's the way, at least partly, we think. On the other hand, my experiment might be, say, something completely the opposite, or may not support what I thought, how the brain works when it thinks. So now what do? I change what I think was my model, right? And I now say, well, maybe it's something else, and I try to formulate a different experiment. Or maybe my experiment was wrong in the first place, the way I did it. So I would change it. So what I tell people is that this is the same way I think about God, right? And I mean, the scriptures tell us that we really don't know what God is like. In fact, it tells us not to even try to know fully what God is like, because it's impossible, right?
Right.
But well, why do we still persist in this? Because we have some images of what God is like. If you read scriptures that say, well, some people think God is like a very wise old father who's a good king, or a person who really cares about somebody. And we have some anthropomorphic sense of what God is like. Well, we definitely know God is not like that, right? That's just one piece of what we think.
Right.
But it's a useful beginning point from which to explore further what this reality called God is like. So I say, well, let's assume God is like my big daddy, you know, it's very far away. So if I then say, if I pray in a certain way, right, then if God works like that, then such and such should happen, right? If I ask my daddy for something that I really want desperately, then maybe I should get that, right? And so I might pray that way. Then I probably don't get what I ask for, right? So does that mean God doesn't exist? Well, it could be God doesn't exist, is one possibility, right? Or it could be my notion of God is not what it should be. Or it could be my experiment was wrong, the way I prayed was all wrong. Maybe that's not the way you pray. So then I got to think of different ways. And so I constantly keep evolving my understanding of what God is. Now you'd say, what the heck is that word? Well, why do we want to do that? Right? I think the purpose when you do that is that every time you do, even in science, an experiment and it fails, you learn something from it.